Back end of May, beginning of June, Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann joined me, and we talked about a lot of different things, but the redistricting conversation was front and center. And one of the things that both the Senate and the House have done is put together a committee, a joint legislative redistricting committee. They had their first public forum last week at Itawamba Community College. And it's a listening session and kind of an explanatory session. I think one of the members of the committee said, hey, we're not here to debate. We're here to listen and to try to answer questions. All of this is a result of the Supreme Court decision in Calais versus Louisiana, in which the Supreme Court ultimately said that voting districts cannot be drawn solely on the basis of race. One of the things that we know about the voting districts as they exist today, not just in Mississippi, but in many places all across the country, is that they had previously been drawn specifically on race. BVAP is a term, Black Voting Age Population. And courts across the country handed down decisions that said you've got to redraw districts to create majority-minority districts, which in and of itself is saying you have to draw districts based on race. And so Mississippi began this process shortly after the legislative session ended, putting together this committee. There were some people who raised their eyebrows about the composition of the committee on the Senate side, in that Democrat leader, Senate Democrat leader Derrick Simmons was placed on the Select Committee on Redistricting. I asked the Lieutenant Governor specifically about that placement when we visited back in early June.
I'd like to start here, and this may sound blunt the way that I asked this. You've put together a Senate Select Committee to study the redistricting issue. The House has done that as well. You put a Democrat on that committee, Derrick Simmons. Why? I think there are a lot of people that are not only curious but concerned as to why you would appoint him to that committee.
On here we go. First of all, First of all, Richard, I want to win. I intend to win. So take a little bit of a look at this. Every member of those committees on the Joint Legislative Committee from last time, all of them are. Okay? Mm-hmm. And so they're going to be the ones that do the redistricting. So there's been no change in that. They were all appointed again. There are 2 Democrats on there. 2. On the House, there are 5 Democrats on their committee. I assume he wants to win, too. When we go to redistrict Mississippi, we're going to end up probably getting sued. And the way to win being sued is we're going to follow the Gingles case. We have thrown out Kalis. Thank goodness that's gone. And for us, we're going to go back to where we have political performance, geographical compactness, communities of interest, county lines, city lines, all the things that it takes for us to win. When y'all hired me as Secretary of State, we got voter ID. We're the only state that didn't get sued. There's a way to do this. And the way to do this is to follow the constitutional law and at least have the visible view that we are inclusive in Mississippi. Otherwise, the first pleadings will be nobody had anything to do. There was no Democrats. For example, we have now removed from all of our calculations that we keep at the state anything about black voting age population, BVAP. Everything that I'm looking at right now and my committee is looking at is Democrat and Republican, which is allowed under the new law. And specifically under the Gingles case, we can have it where we have the process where it can be partisan.
Which is an interesting piece of this with regard to redistricting. You cannot draw district lines based on race. You can draw them based on partisanship.
Well, you can draw them on the matters which I told you, your political connections, your city, your counties, your economics, your geographic, you can draw them on that. And if that ends up being excessively political, that's acceptable under the new case. So the one thing we don't want to do is draw it on race. And so where you hear these guys out here saying, oh, we need to go draw it right now, we need to get rid of ex-congressman or something like that. No. That all that's going to do is get us sued again. And I want to be real clear about this. I'm sick of the federal government drafting how I draft my legislature, my Supreme Court, and my congressional districts. This is the last time they're going to do that. We're going to do it right. We're going to win again. Now, to do that, I have got to be very specific here. And you'll hear these people saying, oh, we can do it over the Internet. We should do it right now. Let me ask you another question. I'm glad you brought this up. Let me ask you a question. How many times have you heard someone say that you would know that it's famous? I appreciate your attention to this matter in Mississippi. The president has not asked this. Now, I'm in touch with the White House as recently as yesterday, and so is all the other people down here. I'm sure the legislature, the House is, the governor is, surely. But nowhere in there have you seen the president of the United States. He's got his own Truth Social saying Mississippi needs to redistrict. Now, he said that other places, but he hasn't said that here. So think about it a little bit. We're following what the White House has asked us to do as part of this. And the other thing is, we're sick of the federal government dictating Mississippi's politics about our redistricting. And we're going to win. And we're going to follow this case all the way out. And we're going to redistrict ourselves, and it's going to stick. And we're going to win the case.
That was Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann back in June when I asked him, and it was a very straightforward question to start. You put a Democrat on this redistricting select committee. Why is Derrick Simmons on this? Senate Democratic leader. And his response was, because we want to win. And then he went on to explain that in great detail, saying that, look, when we draw new districts, we're going to be sued. And we don't want to have a court say, well, you didn't include any Democrats in this process. I suppose a reasonable explanation. But he was adamant that because Derrick Simmons was on the previous committee that drew the districts that exist right now, that he should be on the committee as well. Well, we find out that the lieutenant governor has removed Derrick Simmons from a select committee on redistricting that is tasked with advising the full chamber on redrawing electoral maps after the Supreme Court decision, the Calais decision. Now, it is worth noting, and I suppose it's important to this conversation, especially based on the explanation that the lieutenant governor gave, that he replaced Simmons with another Democrat. Albert Butler, senator from Port Gibson, took that spot. Why, though, was Derrick Simmons removed from the committee? We'll get to that coming up next. Get to your comments on the C Spire text line. Mose on the C Spire text line. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Derrick Simmons come out and say something negative about the committee and redistricting? I'd say he showed he already made his mind up how this was going to go. And I said to Mose, patience, young grasshopper. That is exactly where we are headed next. So Derrick Simmons, Senate Democrat leader, has been removed from the Select Committee on Redistricting by the Lieutenant Governor and has been replaced with Senator Albert Butler, a Democrat from Port Gibson. It comes after a letter that was sent jointly to Delbert Hosemann and House Speaker Jason White from Simmons, Robert Johnson, House Minority Leader, and Legislative Black Caucus Chairman Kabir Karriem, in which they said they did not believe that lawmakers should redraw political districts. Quote, the legislature cannot and should not revert to lines or schemes that have already been determined to dilute black voting strength, which could constitute intentional discrimination. Indeed, it does not need to draw new lines at all. In a statement, Derrick Simmons said that he respects the lieutenant governor's authority to appoint senators to committees, but he believes that the legislature should not redraw the lines. And he says, my position on mid-decade redistricting remains unchanged. I continue to believe that any consideration of redistricting should be legally justified, transparent, and accompanied by meaningful public input. All right, we got two statements, one from that letter from Simmons, Johnson, and Karriem, in which they say the legislature cannot and should not revert to lines or schemes that have already been determined to dilute black voting strength. Well, that is factually inaccurate. When you put the word the legislature cannot, yes, the legislature can redraw the lines, whether it is going back to previous district lines or starting from scratch and redrawing them. The legislature actually has the power and the authority to do just that. Now, should not is a matter of opinion. And then in Simmons' statement, he says, I continue to believe that any consideration of redistricting should be legally justified, transparent, and accompanied by meaningful public input. Well, Senator, check, check, and check. The legal justification is the ruling by the Supreme Court in Calais versus Louisiana, in which the Supreme Court of the United States of America said district lines cannot be drawn solely based on race. When you have had a previous judicial decision that says you must create majority-minority districts, you've already had district lines that have been drawn and legally justified based on race. Secondly, he says the process should be transparent. What has happened so far that gives the illusion that this is not a transparent process? Not saying we can't get there. Not saying that there aren't conversations that will happen, have happened, or going to happen behind closed doors. But so far, this has been a very transparent process. Committee meetings that are open to public. And then he says, accompanied by meaningful public impact. You have senators and representatives who are spending almost the entirety of the months of August and September traveling all over the state of Mississippi to host public forums in which members of the public are allowed to speak out on this matter and to ask questions about this matter. How else would you like to see public input? What better way is there to do that? Generally, the legislature in Mississippi redraws district lines once a decade after the census. This is a mid-sentence redistricting process. But it's not the same as what has happened in Texas and California and Florida. Those processes began before the Calais decision. Mississippi has taken a pretty careful approach in that they have awaited the Supreme Court to hand down that decision and, frankly, have been kind of slow in moving on this. Because of the timing of when Calais was handed down by the Supreme Court, Mississippi said, we've had primaries. We probably could ram this process through, but we're not going to do that right now. Leadership has also taken a very pragmatic approach to the way they are going about the redrawing of district lines. Legislative and judicial first before ultimately moving on to congressional. At least we think that's the way it's going to go. So I thought it was significant for us to go back and play the words of Delbert Hosemann on this program when he vehemently defended leaving Derrick Simmons on this committee. And his rationale was, I want to win. And his explanation for that rationale was, Simmons was on the previous redistricting committee. Once we come up with these new district lines, inevitably we will be sued. We need to be able to point to all parties being involved in the process in our defense of the new district lines. But then, after adamantly defending Derrick Simmons being on this committee, ultimately he has removed Derrick Simmons from the committee. And I think it's because this is not the same as a jury. It's not the same thing. But if a juror speaks out about a case publicly prior to being selected, they won't be a juror. And if during the process of a trial, a jury speaks to a newspaper reporter or a radio host or anybody else, then you're going to end up with a mistrial because of a lack of impartiality among the juror. I'm assuming that the rationale for removing Senator Simmons here is that he very publicly has said this process shouldn't happen. I disagree with this process. We shouldn't be doing this. We cannot be doing this. Which, again, there's fallacy in because the legislature can do this. And so my assumption is that the lieutenant governor viewed that letter and the subsequent statement from Derrick Simmons as disqualifying for his participation on the committee, in so much as he's not really going into it with an open mind. Simmons would probably argue that it's a predetermined outcome regardless, and so what difference does it make whether or not he has an open mind? But in fairness to the lieutenant governor, he did appoint another Democrat to the committee, presumptively for the same reason that Simmons was put on the committee in the first place, to show that there is some level of balance between Republicans and Democrats in the committee. So, we shall see where this goes moving forward. One of the things that, and this is something that we've talked about previously, that I'm really interested to see with all of this is, do we just revert to the 2022 lines, the 2022 districts? You remember both the House and the Senate lost Republican representation after those district lines were redrawn at the behest of a federal district court. But those lines, even though the legislature overwhelmingly approved them, were drawn pre-Calais, meaning that majority-minority played a role in the way the district lines were drawn. Is everybody okay with that for the redrawing of these district lines? Or is it a start-from-scratch conversation?